Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name is Julian Frommel from Utrecht University. It's a pleasure to present our CHI paper, Toxicity in Online Games, the Prevalence and Efficacy of Coping Strategies. This is work that I've done together with my colleague Regan Mandryk at the University of Victoria. Context for this is toxicity in online games. And toxicity is an umbrella term that we use for various types of negative behaviors and communications directed at other players that usually violate the rules or social norms of games. And toxicity is very prevalent, for example, with surveys showing that 83% of adult gamers experienced harassment in multiplayer games. And this is usually pretty bad for us because it harms mood, social capital, and well-being, and it has been associated with psychological distress and loneliness. A few of the reasons for why it persists are normalization. This means that more and more people accept toxicity as a normal part of games, which means that they're not necessarily reporting it anymore. And on the other hand, it is nowadays very much subjective what is and is not toxic. So that makes it also difficult to combat because we can't agree on what is and is not fine. Because of these reasons, it's difficult to prevent exposure to toxicity completely. So in this study, we wanted to see what happens after that. We investigate how do players cope with toxicity after it has occurred. And for that, we consider coping as regulation under stress, which means that exposure to toxicity is a stressful situation that people cope with. And that means that they have behavioral, emotional, and cognitive responses to that. We wanted to see how do players do that and what are these things that they do. For that purpose, we conducted a formative literature study to identify what people in literature have suggested about that, and then conducted a survey study with players to understand what they're thinking about this. In this formative study, we used papers that we knew from our own research on toxicity as related to coping with toxicity, and then additionally added a couple of papers from a scoped review in the context of coping with toxicity and harassment. This resulted in a final list of 10 papers that we then use to iteratively generate a list of coping approaches. We did an initial iterative coding to identify a first set of these approaches and then went through affinity mapping and theme generation to identify overlaps and similar strategies and the ones that are separate. Importantly, we looked for strategies that may be useful for positive coping. That means help people move on or feel better. And we didn't consider approaches that are maladaptive, like blaming myself for exposure to toxicity. This resulted in this list of 20 different approaches that we can't go into detail for the time, but a couple of examples include disabling different communication channels, for example, voice chat or text chat. It also includes other things like laughing about the situation, laughing it off, quitting games completely, but also confrontation. So this provides an overview of what people have suggested in literature about how people deal with toxicity. What we then did is we wanted to see how players think about that, and we conducted an online survey on Prolific. We recruited 244 participants and asked them to think about one online game that they play regularly. Then we measured coping behaviors and experiences. We used the list of coping approaches that we had to basically generate scales for the prevalence of these strategies. We asked people how often do they use any of these different strategies. And we found that overall there was a lot of variance in how much they were used, with the ones that were most common being the ones that are commonly the things that you already know from in-games. For example, muting a player, reporting, but also disabling text channels. So things that are facilitated through the game, but also things that are more that you ignore it and laugh it off. On the other hand, things that are suggested in literature, like seeking support, were less common. What we also did is we asked the people to pick the one strategy that they use most frequently. And this was pretty similar overall, with the ones that were mentioned most frequently being the ones that were higher on the frequency overall. But the interesting thing is that 19 out of the 20 strategies were mentioned at least once, highlighting that there was a large variety in coping approaches and the ways for how people deal with toxicity. To make things a bit more manageable and provide an overview of more higher level strategies, we conducted an exploratory factor analysis, identifying 5 different coping strategies. This was switching to a context without the player, blocking the source, confronting the perpetrators, accepting the problem, and seeking support from others and resources. And similar for like how the different approaches differed in frequency, there was also difference in how often these strategies or how prevalent these strategies were, with blocking the source more common, accepting the problem more common, and seeking support less common. Then we were interested in the effectiveness of these coping strategies, and related to the one that they use most frequently, we asked participants how often they use the strategies, if they have sufficient in-game support to use this strategy, and if it is effective. That means if it makes them feel better and or move on if they use the strategy. Then we conducted regression and mediation analysis, better understanding what are factors that affect the effectiveness. And we found that the effectiveness was negatively associated with being the target of toxicity and positively associated with the usage of the copying approach and the in-game access. Basically meaning it is more effective if you use it more frequently and if you have in-game access to the coping approach. On the other hand, it is less effective if you're more often target of toxicity. We further then conducted this mediation analysis to better understand the relationship between the in-game access, frequency, and effectiveness, and found that in-game access predicts frequency of use, which then also predicts effectiveness, highlighting that there is a direct effect, an indirect effect from in-game access on effectiveness through increased usage. But there was also a direct effect that was not explained through frequency of use, highlighting that in-game access to coping support is beneficial both by highlighting, by increasing the frequency of use, but also just in general having access to the tool. The main contributions from the study are that there is variety in coping approaches. 19 out of the 20 coping approaches were chosen by the participants as the one that they use most frequently in the games. We identified 5 different strategies with blocking the source, accepting the problem, confronting perpetrators, switching context, and seeking support. We got a better understanding of effectiveness of coping, better highlighting how it is associated with in-game access to support, frequency of use, but also exposure to toxicity. And finally, we found that in-game access to coping is important. It is related to the effectiveness with increased usage, but also directly. And we think that it is important to include tools into games that support coping and that HCI can help with that. In the paper, you can find more in-depth discussion and other results like the relationship to overall coping styles. To close, I want to highlight that toxicity is a reality of online games that is virtually impossible to prevent completely, for example, due to normalization and subjectivity. We think that we need a better understanding of what happens after exposure. We think that coping needs more attention in the context of online toxicity because it can help mitigate the harm from exposure. Thank you very much.